What's up everybody, and welcome back to the series. I'm Maclure. Having successfully placed our first ever probe into lunar orbit in the last episode, yet having still much work to perform there, we returned with the flight of Lunar 3, our second impact mission. Unfortunately, this time around, I failed to insert the probe into the correct inclination in the LEO parking orbit, and try as I might, there was just no way to get an encounter with the moon. And so, even with a flawless performance from the Atlas Baker rocket, the mission was a failure. Our second mission in this episode was a simple fulfillment of a pair of contracts, 2 satellites to be placed in very similar orbits. But inasmuch as we had been blessed by the rocketry gods thus far in our program, our second flight seemed to suggest a change in fortunes. Seshat-1, named after the ancient Egyptian goddess of wisdom, was intended to remain in Leo for about 24 hours, where it would collect science from various biomes and return the findings back to Earth. While not directly fulfilling any specific contract, Seshat-1 was to play a pivotal role in our program, in that it would provide some significant scientific returns, enabling our research and development center to accelerate its development of crewed flight technologies. But our previous misfortunes continued to haunt us yet again. Performance loss in the sustainer engine and even one of the verniers meant our mission was now at great risk of not being able to reach orbit. But the call to press on and attempt to reach orbit nevertheless, even if but a compromised one, was taken, and so the rocket forged ahead. As fate would have it, following a burn to depletion on the Baker upper stage, Seshat-1 ultimately failed to reach orbit. All that remained now was a fiery fall back to Earth. In a surprise twist which did offer some consolation, the return capsule, unsurprisingly one could say, did survive the ordeal. Much to my surprise came the good news that even though we had failed to reach orbital velocities, we nevertheless achieved a sufficiently high velocity to clinch an all-important milestone. Having fallen behind our intended schedule for crewed missions, yet being unrelenting in our pursuits, we accept the all-important contract of first crewed orbit. With one of 2 previous satellite contracts still up for grabs, a second similar contract was accepted to increase yields. While not being a significant payout, the difference between completing the contract and receiving due payment versus funds lost for failing the contract certainly warranted the effort, particularly in a rideshare context, where one can complete two for the price of one. Having successfully completed the first leg of the flight, one of the two XLR-11 engines failed to ignite. Thus it was that for the third flight in a row, our mission met an untimely demise. In what proved to be a continuation of a series of unfortunate events, Lunar 5, our second attempt at orbiting the moon, suffered a dual engine failure, followed by a third while sitting on the launch pad. The rocket would be rolled back to the VAB, where all of its engines would be replaced with new ones. In a twisted, almost sickening stroke of bad luck, Lunar 5, on its second attempt to reach the moon now, suffered another, this time fatal blow, when one of its booster LR-89 engines failed during flight. Finally, after several back-to-back failed flights, we had reached orbit carrying aloft two basic communication satellites on another rideshare mission. After circularization was complete, the first satellite was successfully deployed, marking the first positive outcome in the past little while. Miscalculations during mission planning resulted in an error for the estimated required delta V for the mission, resulting in a much lower than intended apogee value for our second satellite, initially aiming for 4,500. Utilizing the satellite's onboard thrusters yielded moderate improvements. Ultimately, the second satellite failed to reach its intended orbit. 4, the replacement to the ill-fated Lunar 5, ushered in a most welcome sigh of relief when it reached orbit and did so in the proper inclination. All stages would perform as required, and for the third time in our program's history, a satellite was successfully sent to the Moon. Firing right on time, Lunar 4 was placed into a low lunar orbit, where it will remain indefinitely. An unfortunate oversight in mission planning, however, meant that a redundant set of sensors to the Lunar 2 mission would yield moderate scientific gains. In an attempt to alleviate the frustratingly abundant communication blackout zones experienced during many missions, our agency was charged with the objective of creating the first ever satellite-based communications network. After successfully reaching its intended orbit, the first of the communication satellites was successfully deployed, followed soon thereafter by the second. While not intended for the long haul, solar panel technology still being in a relatively primitive state, it is hoped that the network would still serve out its purpose of extending and supplementing existing coverage. Simple to produce and replace and easily put into orbit, the Alignak communication satellites, it is presently believed, could see a high flight rate as aging satellites become obsolete and new ones sent aloft to replace them. In the first of a planned 5 flights totaling 10 Alignak satellites for the network, Alignak satellites 1 and 2 successfully entered their intended orbits. Seshat-2, a carbon copy replacement of its ill-fated predecessor, launched atop its Atlas Baker rocket and entered into its designated orbit. Comprised of a biological sample, advanced biological sample, and an early camera pod, Seshat-2 would spend the next 24 hours covering several biomes and collecting invaluable scientific data. With the planned orbit time complete and the scientific experiments finished or depleted, it was now time to return the all-important data back home. Having encountered some difficulties regarding ground station coverage, the retro pack could not be fired at the most optimal time, and so a little unplanned fine-tuning maneuver had to be performed. With the scientific returns obtained from Sechat 2, we were now able to kick into high gear our research and development center and unlock several of the critically important nodes that we'll need to enable the agency's goal of crewed orbit. The 1960s orbital rocketry brought with it a new generation of the LR-89 booster engine and LR-85 sustainer engine, both featuring most notably improved thrust. To prove out these new engine variants and increase our chances of them performing accordingly further down the road, Atlas FT-02 was sent aloft to produce some much needed flight time. After performing nearly a full orbit, having fallen just short of entering orbit, and there was still some fuel in the tank, Atlas FT-02's orbit would eventually decay. In what was supposed to have been a simple dual payload contract fulfillment mission would, due to unfortunate circumstances, turn into a third flight with several contract renewals in the process. But this time around, the tides would turn. The Atlas Baker rocket reached the intended orbit, and having taken a ride on the now improved stretch tank variant of the Atlas Baker, there was still some much needed fuel reserves left over for the next leg of the mission. Satellite number 1 was successfully deployed, and later on, the Baker's dual XLR-11 engines would relight, boosting the Apogee to a value of over 6,000 kilometers. This time around, there would be no need to use any onboard thrusters. That's gonna do it for this episode. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch it. I really hope it made your day a little brighter. Let me know your thoughts about the episode in the comments below. I always enjoy reading them. And if you feel so inclined, do like and subscribe. It really does help the channel to grow. In case you might have missed it, we had our very first live stream event. If you weren't able to participate, it's available in the livestream playlist on the channel. I hope you'll tune in next time. Crewed flight is just around the corner, and things are about to get very exciting. Until next time, I'll see you on the next flight.